This is TWiT.
So arguably, no rock band in existence is more meticulously tracked and obsessed over than the Beatles. Personally, I'm a huge fan. My favorite album has always been the 1966 classic Rubber Soul. As a lifelong Beatles fan, I've often found myself caught up in tracking the mythology, just like every other crazy Beatles fan out there. The legacy, the many unanswered questions that help kind of elevate the Beatles to the legendary status that they are in music history. One of the many unanswered questions has been the true authorship of the music in the classic track In My Life. That's the 23rd on Rolling Stone's list of 500 greatest songs of all time, and it's also found on the Rubber Soul album. A few folks finally did the rest of us lazy fans a solid by applying mathematical and statistical analysis to the Beatles catalog in order to figure it out once and for all. Who wrote the music to that track? And we're welcoming to the show Mark Glickman, PhD, senior lecturer on statistics at Harvard University. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on your show.
You bet. It's great to get you here, and I assume you've been very, very busy because the story is awesome, and I know you've been making the rounds, so we really appreciate you coming on to talk to us today. So first of all, you, Dr. Jason Brown, Ryan Song, the three of you must be true hardcore Beatles fans if you're willing to embark on this journey. Was this born out of a love of music, or was this kind of pursuit of just a really good challenge?
I would end up saying that it was a combination of both, I suppose. I met Jason at a conference a couple years ago where I was presenting some work that I do in statistics and sports. And somehow we got around to talking after my talk, and we pretty quickly converged on both of our interest in music, in particular the Beatles. And Jason was telling me about some work that he had done on figuring out the first chord of A Hard Day's Night using some mathematical ideas, essentially using Fourier analysis to decompose the actual frequencies into their constituent waveforms. And he was able to back out what the actual arrangement was for that chord. So he was telling me how, I was also kind of thinking about like ways of characterizing, all the different songs in a particular way using graph theory. And so I was thinking, actually that's an interesting issue, trying to get a sense for, who wrote what based on some, musical features of the songs that could be analyzed in a quantitative way. And that's basically what the origin was for the work that we did. Ryan is a student of mine, and I got connected to him because, he's also a hardcore Beatles fan, and he wanted to do like an independent study with me at Harvard. And this was the perfect project, so he ended up helping us kind of develop this work.
And was this purely about In My Life as the example, or was this really about just analyzing Beatles songs, understanding the kind of the mathematics that make up the song kind of approach of each author, and then somewhere along the way you realize, hey, here's a riddle that we can finally figure out based on these systems that we've created?
It was definitely motivated by In My Life. This is something that Jason has been thinking about for a long time. But I think we decided that there was a broader question, which is how do you characterize a songwriter's fingerprint in a quantitative way? And so it actually had a broader scope than just simply trying to figure out quantitatively who is likely to have written the music for In My Life.
So most people will say that John's music was more reflective, whereas Paul's was more like about love, but you're not talking about the lyrics at all. This is purely just the music, right?
Correct. Yeah. So we're focused only on the music. I mean, I have a colleague of mine who was commenting to me, kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way. It's like, if you really want to figure out who wrote the song and you're trying to do it in a probabilistic way, why don't you just simply use the person who sang it? And that'll get you like 90% of the way there. And that's true. But that doesn't really extend very well if the goal is really to be able to characterize musical style based on musical content.
Well, and not to mention, I mean, the reason that this is kind of a confusing question to begin with is that, throughout the history of the Beatles lore, both back in the day, and then over the years, there are many clues. There are many ways in which any number of the bandmates had said that this person was responsible for this person was responsible for this. But in the case of In My Life, there was conflicting opinions by both Paul McCartney and John Lennon, in the sense that both of them at some point or another said that they were pretty much responsible for the music. So it was an open question of like, all right, who's misremembering here? And, enter statistics and math to actually kind of analyze their writing styles in a holistic sense up to Rubber Soul, and then figure out from there, okay, this actually matches these patterns. So how similar would you say from a mathematical sense were those writing styles? How specific were you able to get based on the system you set up here?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are certainly some features that were not too surprising that came out of our approach, but then there were some that we didn't entirely expect. So, for example, one of the things that sort of popped out of the model is that that John Lennon tended to use melodies that generally stayed on the diatonic scale. And so I'm going to embarrass myself by doing a little bit of singing. The diatonic scale, like say if you're singing in the key of C, so it would be C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Those 8 notes, really 7 because I repeated the last one an octave up, are the notes on a diatonic scale. When you start moving away from those notes, like if you were at a piano and you just played all white notes, those notes are the notes of a diatonic scale for the key of C. Once you start going to the black notes, those are not in the diatonic scale. So Paul McCartney tended to use those notes a lot more often in the songs than John Lennon did. And that's something actually that came right out of the model, that we actually saw that songs where John Lennon was making transitions between diatonic scale notes tended to be much more frequent than songs that Paul McCartney was using the same kind of moves. So that's just one example.
So I read that some of the tools you use are the same or similar to the tools used in spam filters. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so what we do is we end up basically taking we're using kind of the same kind of text analysis sorts of techniques that are used like in spam filters, where you might end up trying to find in spam filters you're usually seeking for certain frequencies of certain kinds of words that might be indicative of spam. Like you might see a word like sale or I don't know, but buy, you might see phrases "buy now" or maybe some other salacious kinds of phrases. So you would see emails that actually have large occurrences of those kinds of words would be indicative of spam. In our setting, what we do is we look for occurrences, and without knowing in advance what the frequency is going to be, but we look for occurrences of particular musical motifs and count them. So that count over a single song is essentially a piece of information that reflects how frequently that particular motif is occurring. And we know for 70 of the songs that we were analyzing who actually wrote the song. So there's 70 songs and song fragments between 1962 and 1966 that are Lennon and McCartney songs where there's no dispute who wrote them. So we can basically train our model based on these 70 songs and examine the frequencies of occurrences of these various words. And the words are really things like the actual notes or individual chords or chord transitions or note transitions and melodies, or longer sequences of notes called contours that basically give the shape of the melody. And using all of those as individual words, we can essentially relate whether a song was written by John Lennon or Paul McCartney to those frequencies, and then pick up whether a song was likely to have been written by John or Paul.
And you're talking about the bags of words model, I believe it's called, right?
Right.
In this case, words doesn't necessarily mean actual words. It means
Right.
these kind of like motifs or phrases or whatever.
Right. So the term bags of words, I think, came out of a more of a machine learning context. So I'm technically a statistician, and that's a term that is not very commonly used, or hasn't been traditionally commonly used.
Got it.
But bags of words essentially says, give me some text and then identify a whole bunch of words that I want to count the frequency of. And the counts attached to each of those words is the bag of words. It's the bag of words that are a collection of those words and their frequencies.
So you're talking, kind of touching on it a little bit, but what do you think of the kind of the power, the abilities and the growing abilities of neural networks in analysis like this? I mean, I'm pretty sure you weren't directly employing neural networks for your analysis, or maybe you were, but are you excited about kind of what the doors that opens for this type of analysis?
Right. So you're correct that we weren't using neural nets, but for this kind of a problem, what we were doing was we were using a fully Bayesian analysis. So it's a Bayesian analysis of multinomial outcomes, essentially. There's a little more, actually quite a bit more detail than that, but
Sure.
Overall, that's what we were using. But with neural nets, in specific, recursive neural nets are quite impressive at making sense out of language, like basically a sequence of words. And I don't know how much has actually been done. There's a little bit that's been done, but not a lot, on being able to parse through sets of music using recursive neural nets, because they're very good at like picking up repeated structures, which songs of course have, and being able to extract information that's relevant for predicting certain outcomes. In this case, an outcome would be the author of the song. So I think in general, neural nets and deep learning is pretty spectacular at what it can do. There's a certain statistical underpinning that's not really completely understood, and there's a very active area of statistical research trying to make sense out of why deep networks work, and that's something that really is going to be tying together the worlds of statistical research and neural nets.
Oh, I'm sure. So we got to wrap this up and move on. But I just realized at this point we haven't even said the outcome of this study. People are like, seriously, we're 15 minutes into this interview, we still don't know who wrote the dang song. Is that an ending you wish to spoil right now? What did you find?
I'm sure. Yeah, sure. I'm happy to mention it. So our model predicts that there's a 98.2% chance that John Lennon wrote the music for In My Life. And just to put a little bit more context, I'll mention two quick things. One is that John Lennon was known to have written the lyrics for the song. There's no dispute about that. The question is who wrote the music. And our model basically says that John Lennon very, very likely wrote it. So that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that John really had a very good chance of writing it. It's entirely possible, for example, that Paul might have been purposely emulating John's style when he wrote it. It's just basically saying that the musical features of the song In My Life are much more consistent with John Lennon's style of writing than it is for Paul. That's basically the conclusion that we get from our model.
Well, it's fascinating. I loved this story when I first saw it, and I'm super thrilled that we could get you on, Mark, to talk about it. I love that you've taken the time to pick this apart. It makes the Beatles nerd in me so happy. So, Mark Glickman, it was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your show.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you soon.